Welcome, everyone.
Yes,
Um,
indeed.
there's Diane. Diane, we're going to give people a few more minutes to get in. I just wanted to give a quick welcome to those of you who are in the waiting room already. I'm Susan Hammond. I'm the director of the War Legacies Project, based here in Vermont. We're in the middle of sugaring season at the moment. It's been slow going because of the weather, but Diane's joining us from across the continent in Santa Barbara.
And I'm so happy to see so many of you. Welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us. We'll begin later.
Yeah. Okay. We'll give it, there's a few more people joining in, so I'm going to give them another minute. Sorry, I have a bit of a cold, so my voice is a little shaky this morning. Right now, we have you all muted, but we will, once we get the Q&A started, we'll make sure that people are unmutable so that they can join in the discussion.
Mm.
Okay, we'll give it about one more minute. I keep seeing
Oh,
people joining, which is a great thing.
it is a great thing.
Yeah.
I see people from this continent. I see a couple of people from Europe, and all across the continent. I think there's somebody from South who's currently in South America.
All right, I think we can go. The joining, the people have slowed down. I'll add you if when I see you pop up on the screen. So
Okay.
welcome everyone. Diane, I'm going to turn it right over to you. We have a big celebration with your new book coming out. It's been um, a journey for sure over many decades.
Mm.
But it's still a very valuable book in addition to the literature on the Agent Orange issue. So I'm going to turn it right over to you, Diane.
All right. Thank you, Susan. And thank you all for being here. Um, I, I think of it as a book launch rather than a celebration. I think, as some of you know, I say the celebration will be when we don't need books like this anymore. This is a book of stories told by people in the center, north, and south of Vietnam, of their experiences with what the Red Cross identifies as Agent Orange, the consequences of war. Um, so I'll be reading one of the stories from the book, and I'm so pleased, happy, grateful that two friends are here, two friends and colleagues. Susan, who has just spoken to you, the director of War Legacies Project, who will give an update on the work that's currently going on, and Lady Borton, who has been with Vietnam since the time of the war with the American Friends Service Committee, is currently still working as a writer and facilitator extraordinaire, bringing people together in reconciliation and moving the consequences of war. There are other people on this Zoom I see to celebrate. I thank you each and all for all you have done from the early stages specifically now for the book, from the early stages of introductions to people in the book, from your own work, from reading, right through the last little copy edits on the book. So thank you each, and thank you all. Um, so it is a celebration of that. For me, it's a celebration of you all and what you have brought to the book, but more importantly, to the work on Agent Orange, to the work of reconciliation, to the work of bringing people together after the war. I'd also like to celebrate all of you who are simply here um, who have not turned away, who give your attention to this issue that has lingered for now half a century. And I'd like to say to you what one of the people I interviewed said to me, which was, your attention, the attention of the American people, is a precious spiritual gift. That struck me very deeply. Uh, there were many other comments, of course. Another comment to pair with that is the man who said, yes, but we don't need your respect. We need help. And Susan will bring us some of the things that we can still do, we still need to do to help. And there are other people on this Zoom who may do that as well. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your attention to this issue. The way we've organized this Zoom, I'll read one of the stories first, and then Susan will bring an update, and then late update of the work that is ongoing in Vietnam, Laos, and Washington, D.C. And Charles, if you want to chime in, that would be wonderful too. Lady Borton afterwards will give an overview of the history, and Charles can certainly add to that as well. So thank you all, and I'll begin with the reading. This reading is from a province in the north, Taiping. It's about, at the time I was there, it was about a 3-hour drive south of Hanoi. And I was taken there by a woman who grew up in the province. She then went on to work with Save the Children US. She was working on maternal and child health, and she had worked a lot with the Committee for Care and Protection of Children in Taiping. When she heard I was interested in Agent Orange, in the stories told by people affected by Agent Orange, she organized me and the committee to go listen to these stories. So this is one of the first stories that I heard. And as I read the words of the story, Susan will show the pictures of the people who are truly speaking. So I guess, Susan, we're ready to go. So from the committee office, the Committee for Care and Protection of Children in the provincial capital, we drive deep into the Delta, through rice fields that stretch green as far as the eye can see, into the cold, gray winter drizzle. At a small town, we turn off the paved road and follow a dirt lane to where it dead ends at a dike. From there, we walk a kilometer or so across the top of the dike, along a narrow path bordered on both sides by rows of lettuce and aromatic herbs. Tall trees protect the greens from the withering sun of other days. Ducks swim in the water channeled at the base of the dike. Chicken cages dot its banks. When we arrive at Mrs. Ha's home, she is cooking lunch over an open fire in the detached kitchen. They had expected us earlier, but we were late, and because there was no way to telephone to or from the village, the family had gone back to work, thinking our plans had changed. Mrs. Ha's husband, Mr. Bing, had gone to the communal warehouse to get rice wine to sell in the village, and Mrs. Ha had turned to preparing the family meal. She asks us to wait for her husband's return to begin the interview. As we linger for a moment in the courtyard, family and friends begin to gather, an old man, giving me a sideways glance, tests my Vietnamese. What's this in Vietnamese? He gestures with his chin. Ngôi nhà, I answer, a house. He nods vigorously, then walks up the steps into the new brick house. It turns out house is a significant word, symbolizing the care given by the extended family. Mrs. Ha's older brother, a stocky man in a red shirt, khakis, high rubber boots, and a pith helmet, points to a mud-walled, thatched-roofed house on a low-lying piece of land across the way. You see, that house over there was their house, he tells us. The relatives got together to loan them money to buy this house. It is a loan the relatives know cannot be repaid. My sister and her husband are far too miserable, the brother continues. I mean, in a year, in roughly 12 months, they had to go to the hospital 30 times, and each time there is only us to count on. I think of what it would take to get a sick person to the hospital from there. Down the village lanes to the dike, across the dike to the small country road, through neighboring villages to the main provincial road, and then an hour or so by car to the provincial capital, where the hospital was located. But they would not go by car. Would they go by motorbike? I have only seen bicycles in the village. Who would care for the children left behind? Who would look after the house and tend the crops? We go into the house and sit around a low table on small red plastic chairs. Mrs. Ha's brother pours us small cups of tea. While we are waiting, Mrs. Ha tells us about her husband's many illnesses, recalling, there was a time when the doctors in the hospital in town said, that's all we can do. Let him go home and wait for death. If he craves anything, let him have it. His stomach was swollen, and his skin was completely swollen, and he couldn't go to the bathroom. Neighbors, and then other women, and then organizations gave a bit of rice, a few potatoes, and some kernels of corn. And then, she says, I had to beg for each small contribution. And then I had a dream about going into the forest to get medicine for my husband. So I dove through the mud to get to the forest, all the way to Sapa, which is near the Chinese border. And then there was medicine to give my husband, folk medicine, and he took it, and he got better and did not die. My friend Lan turns the conversation to strains these illnesses have put on their marriage. Do you ever get angry or think of leaving? She asks. Mrs. Ha replies, sometimes I refrain from speaking, and sometimes I argue a sentence or two, and then I reflect and pity him and cry, not knowing what to do. He is so thin. His skin is so dark. He is now reaching the time of old age and weakness. His life is like the wind. She turns to speak to the neighbors and friends who, some in shirt sleeves, some bundled in colorful sweaters and scarves, crowd the plank bed and little stools or stand gently jiggling their toddlers up and down as they listen to our conversation. When you are happy, she asks them, do you think you can stay that way forever? We can't be miserable forever, uncles and aunts, grandfathers, can we? That's right. I have to encourage my husband. Mr. Bing comes in, a slight, serious man wearing a bright blue woolen vest over a long-sleeved shirt and faded blue cotton pants. On his feet, a pair of plastic sandals. He tells us that in 1972, before the Paris agreements, he was a special forces soldier in reconnaissance in Taining, a heavily sprayed region in the south. Where he was stationed, the trees were denuded of leaves. He lived in tunnels, bareheaded, barefooted, bare-chested. Another man interjects, camouflaged by spreading mud on his body. We saw 200-liter barrels with yellow stripes, Mr. Bing tells us. They had 3 yellow stripes. We had only been through high school, so we could only read the word dioxin or zeocene or something like that. Although rusting barrels of discarded chemicals are still being unearthed and soil permeated with chemicals still causes deaths, this is likely a misreading of the past based on present concerns. Perhaps the words were do not, or maybe danger. Mr. Bing continues, at the time, we thought whoever died, died at once, and whoever lived, lived whole. He came home with many of the diseases now recognized as possible effects of exposure to dioxin. Diseases of the skin, of the nervous system, of the circulatory system, of the digestive system. The very regrettable after effects of that war you see in the first fetus my wife gave birth to, he tells us, turning to his wife. My wife, right here. It was like a monster in a fairy tale. You know, it didn't have a human shape, and a few minutes after it was born, it died. His lips draw tight, his eyes narrow, remembering. Very, very hard, he says. And my very own wife has many illnesses, most of them women's illnesses. Women also bear the consequences of this war. The couple's second child is mentally slow. He doesn't know anything, they explain, and just turns from side to side. Their third child is a pretty teenager who sits close to her mother's side as we talk, her long black hair draping over a graceful white blouse. She was born epileptic and blind with no pupils. Their fourth child was 16 at the time of the interview and enrolled in school. After her daughter was born, Mrs. Ha said to herself, enough. She explains that she didn't know whether the problem births were because of the war or because of fate, but she went to be sterilized. The procedure, which involved inserting medicine into her fallopian tubes, led to many complications, much loss of blood, and repeated operations. As we spoke, she was in pain with one side of her stomach swollen. This all started from giving birth to children like this, Mrs. Ha explains, and voluntarily going to be sterilized. Then I was unlucky, and the consequences of sterilization was much illness. That made us spend a lot of money that a poor family doesn't have. A very hard situation, very desperate. But it is all for my husband, she continues, all for my children. So I try to overcome the difficulties. I still have to look after my husband and my children. I know my life is deeply entwined with his. Mrs. Ha's brother says he wants to ask me just one more question. In your country, sorry. In your country, he begins, are there children like this? He gestures around the room. I do not understand his implication and cannot answer. Children this strong, this tall, this big, or smaller. One of the women sitting on the bed puts her hand over her mouth, laughs, and exclaims, I've seen on TV. They are big. Vietnamese are the smallest. Mrs. Ha's brother continues, our life here should be like that of our international friends. But because the war lasted far too long, all our lives, we lost the chance to study because at 18 we left school and took up the gun. When the enemy was gone, we came back to feed our children. But there was not enough. So they are sickly and puny like this. You see? These are the consequences of war, Mr. Bing explains. What he is saying is that the consequences of war are very great. Earlier, Mrs. Ha has thanked me and the American government for paying attention to them and trying to help. When Mr. Bing again thanks me as a representative of the American government, I explain that I do not represent the government, that I do not know if the government will help, but that I believe ordinary people will. Because everything comes from the people, doesn't it? Mrs. Ha's brother observes. When he sees I'm again not fully following his meaning, he explains, because if the people have sincere hearts and make demands on their government, most governments must execute those policies, because the government is for the people, isn't it? At the time, his remark puzzled me as it seemed to come straight out of an American high school civics book. Later, I learned that shortly before our visit, farmers in Taiping had rounded up corrupt local government officials and kept them under house arrest until the central government replaced them. Mr. Bing makes this request. I want to ask you to say this to the American people. An unavoidable war broke out between our two countries. In reality, nobody wanted it. Now, both sides understand each other, and the two countries are friends and trade business. He quotes a common saying, close the past and open the future. The two countries circulate goods. They've exchanged ambassadors already. But what happened before, that is, the consequences of the bombs and bullets and of the chemicals, outrages the Vietnamese people. Yes, because the result is not to kill a person at once, but the result waits for the children and for the grandchildren. So I really hope the American people, together with the Vietnamese people, will demand that the American government not produce these chemicals any longer. Don't take them to make war with any other country. What is banned by international law should not be used. So stop using them. Yes, not just I myself in particular, or just the Vietnamese people in particular, but the whole world in general opposes these chemicals. After his words, we fall silent, each of us alone with our separate thoughts. And then it is time to pack up and go. Mr. Bing thanks me again for trying to bring help. I respond that it is rather late. Yes, he agrees. If help had come earlier, his suffering would have been less. But I am still here, he adds, and my wife is still here. Other people told other stories, or thousands of these stories. I will conclude by quoting just a paragraph from another woman that I spoke with, Mrs. Home, who lived in Bien Hoa, across from Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon. This is Mrs. Home. She had one hand shot off by the Americans, and yet she quilts and sews and makes things for people. Remarkable spirit. She had a friend taken up in a helicopter and repeatedly raped and then tossed out dead. Still this spirit. Here's the quote I will leave you with from her, but I want to leave you with two things, both her spirit and the request from Mr. Bing, we are still here. You must tell it. This is Mrs. Holmes speaking. Must put it into the pages of history. It must get into the pages of the history of our country, our generation, of the world. Remember, there is a woman like this, with all these stories, and one hand lopped off in war. But remember, too, that she loves people, she loves her country, and she loves life. Mrs. Holmes died of several cancers that were thought to be the result of Agent Orange. Now I would like to turn the mic over to Susan, who can bring us up to date from these stories. Let me read a little bit of introduction to Susan. Susan Hammond, the daughter of a U.S. Vietnam veteran, became interested in post-war Southeast Asia after traveling to Vietnam and Cambodia in 1991. In 1996, after earning her MA in International Education from NYU, Susan returned to Vietnam to study Vietnamese. She became involved in fostering mutual understanding between the people of the U.S. and Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and addressing the long-term impacts of war, while working as Deputy Director of the Fund for Reconciliation and Development from 1996 to 2007. During this time, she lived in New York, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. In 2007, Susan returned to her home state of Vermont and founded the War Legacies Project to continue addressing the long-term health and environmental impacts of war in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Susan, thank you.
Thank you, Diane, for sharing that story. I neglected to introduce you in the beginning. Diane lived in Vietnam for 6 years, right? Between 8?
10.
10. Oh, my goodness. Sorry. In the early days, from 91 was your first year, I believe. And so she has been engaged in Vietnam for many years and overlapped with my work many times. In fact, she has been helping to raise funds to continue the work of Dr. Nhan in Hue at the rehabilitation center that they're running there for children who have disabilities. So she's been very, in addition to writing this book, she's been very engaged with the issue over the years and has been a great mentor of mine as the years have gone by. I'm going to give just a very sort of brief update of where things have happened since Diane was writing these stories, which would have been in the late like 1997, 98 period, I believe, Diane, in that time frame. And things it was just post-normalization after the U.S. and Vietnam normalized relations, but addressing this issue of Agent Orange had been one of the stumbling blocks is in the relationship. And I'm going to share my screen here again, hopefully. Let's see. And just to sort of put this in context, I mean, when you think about Agent Orange, this image might come to mind, the U.S. spray planes that sprayed over 20 million gallons of herbicides across the southern part of Vietnam, from where the DMZ was up down to the Mekong Delta, and as well as in Laos and parts of Cambodia, but not as much in Cambodia. The main problem, of course, was that 2/3 of the herbicides used were Agent Orange that were then found to be contaminated with dioxin. And dioxin is what is believed to be causing human health impacts on not just the U.S. veterans who served there, of course, but the Vietnamese. the time of the spraying, a lot of the impacts, most notable, of course, was on the environment, to the point where Art Ralston at the University of Yale coined the term ecocide to describe what had happened to the heavily defoliated areas of Vietnam. This is a photo of the Mekong, the mangrove forest outside of Saigon, which were especially impacted. At the time when Diane was writing or doing her interviews, there was work that was being done by an organization called the Hatfield Consultants. They were based in Vancouver, Canada, and they had traveled to Vietnam in the mid 1990s. They had become experts on dioxin from plants in paper plants in Canada, and so they had become very interested in seeing if they could do something to help the Vietnamese with their potential dioxin contamination from the use of these herbicides. And they went up to an area called the Aloe Valley, which is in the just south of the DMZ, bordering Cambodia, bordering Laos, sorry, that was heavily sprayed during the war. And they wanted to know whether there was still a problem with dioxin contamination in the soil from the spraying of these herbicides at this point, 20 plus years after the end of the spraying. Because it was a concern, of course, from the Vietnamese as well. They did not want, as they were expanding their agriculture, they did not want the impression that the whole of Vietnam was contaminated from the use of these herbicides, or the whole of South Vietnam, I should say. So Hatfield went to examine take tests of the soils in the areas that were heavily sprayed with the herbicides, and they found, thankfully, that the areas that were sprayed no longer had high levels of contamination. But the problem was the former military bases. In the Aloe Valley, there were 3 special forces bases, some that had only been used for a very short amount of time. And they found that at the Aso base, which is in the southern part of the valley, still had high levels of dioxin contamination in the soil in the areas where they believed barrels had been stored at the time. And so this developed what they called the hotspot theory, that the areas sprayed by Vietnam during the war by airplanes were no longer heavily contaminated, but you need to focus on the dioxin hotspots where barrels of the herbicides were stored. And this really helped open up the gates into how the US and Vietnam could begin to talk about this issue. Ranch Hand, which was the name of the spray program, was based in several, probably 15 or so different bases throughout Vietnam, but primarily they were at the Bien Hoa base and the Da Nang base, air base, and Phu Cat was another one of the ranch hand bases. And so Hatfield went and began to test these former US bases that were the areas where ranch hand was located, to see is there dioxin contamination in that soil. And they found very high levels, particularly at Bien Hoa and Da Nang. And so the problem of trying to understand what the problem was of Agent Orange throughout the southern part of Vietnam, or rather the dioxin contamination, became limited to these various military bases. And that became a way for the US and Vietnamese government to begin to address this issue. And I must also say that very important to getting this work done by Hatfield was, in the very beginning, Lady Borton, who really helped to get Hatfield to where they needed to go to get the testing, to help the Vietnamese understand what Hatfield wanted to do. And then a little further along in the process, the Ford Foundation helped Hatfield fund some of their testing. It took quite a while, though, to get to this point where the two governments could talk about the Agent Orange issue together. And finally, in 2006, when President Bush went to Vietnam, there was a joint statement between the President Triet of Vietnam and President Bush, saying that we agree that further joint efforts to address the environmental contamination near former dioxin storage facilities would make a valuable contribution to continued development of their bilateral relations. And this really opened the door for further work on this issue. Senator Leahy, who was on the Foreign Appropriations Committee at the time, Foreign Appropriations Committee, was able to put funding into the appropriations bill in 2007 so that there would be money available to begin to help Vietnam and the US governments address this issue of dioxin contamination. And they began at the Da Nang base, which is one of the heavily contaminated bases. And they were able to, over a matter of, at this point, almost 10 years, clean up the dioxin contamination on that base, which cost about $116 million. Then the next phase on the environmental aspect was the US began to help the Vietnamese clean the much larger dioxin contamination site at the Bin Hoa Air Base outside of Ho Chi Minh City, near where Mrs. Hom lived. And that project is still going on today. It's a much larger contamination site that will take up to 450 million or more to clean. But this was getting progress on the environmental side of the issue. The human health side, which was the stories that Diane was gathering, the impacts on the families, took much longer to get a resolution to. The Vietnamese were well aware that the U.S. Veterans Administration was providing disability benefits to people, to the the U.S. soldiers who fought in Vietnam. If they had one of these various 19 different illnesses and cancers that had been found through research by the National Academy of Sciences to be associated to exposure with Agent Orange. They were aware that the U.S. government was funding healthcare as well as disability benefits to U.S. veterans. But at the same time, the U.S. government was saying there was no proven impacts of the health on the Vietnamese. So this contradiction was very difficult obviously for the Vietnamese to accept. And also, the U.S. Veterans Administration would provide support to female veterans who had children who had various disabilities, not for exposure to Agent Orange, though, but for their service to Vietnam. So this was admitting that if you served in Vietnam as a female, there's a potential you could have a child with a severe disability. There were only about 8,000 women who served in Vietnam, so the numbers of people who were receiving these benefits was very, very low. But there was this understanding that there was something toxic that could potentially cause disabilities. And of course, the Vietnamese were doing their own studies. There were many doctors, researchers who had been looking at areas, the health impacts on the people who lived in the sprayed areas, comparing that to the people who were in the non-sprayed areas, and they were finding higher rates of disability in the people who were exposed. So this contradiction really angered, as Diane's story tells, really frustrated the Vietnamese that nothing was being done to help them. So in 2004, the Vietnam Association of Victims of Agent Orange was formed, and they sued the chemical companies that had produced these herbicides. So the Dows and Monsantos, they filed a lawsuit in U.S. courts asking for compensation for the Vietnamese who had been impacted by this issue. And in fact, in this picture, the woman in the wheelchair is Mrs. Hom when she attended one of the hearings in 2007, just a few months before she died. Unfortunately, the lawsuit failed in the U.S. courts. It was determined that because the U.S. government, the chemical companies were government contractors, they were not, they had the same immunity to lawsuits as the U.S. government. So the case was dismissed, and it was also determined that it wasn't a war crime, an international war crime, to use these herbicides at the time because they targeted the environment, not humans. And so there was another reason that the case was dismissed. But what happened was the attention to this lawsuit, both in the Vietnam press as well as the international press, really raised awareness. And they really told those stories, thousands and thousands of stories that Diane mentioned, came out into the press, both in Vietnam as well as internationally. And it became to the point where it was really difficult. It would have been very difficult for the US government to ignore the human health sides of this issue now, because there was such a great push for them to begin to address this problem. And then again, we have Senator Leahy and Tim Reeser, his staffer, to thank for making sure that the money that it was in the foreign appropriations bill also addressed the human health side. And the language over time evolved as the years went by to really target the funding for the human health side of this issue to those who lived in the areas that were heavily sprayed by Agent Orange, but also to provide support to those who were most likely or were considered by the Vietnamese to be impacted by Agent Orange. So those with severe upper and lower body mobility impairment or cognitive or development disabilities. So there was those with very severe disabilities. The funding was aimed at targeting those people who have impacted not just the individuals, but of course the whole family. When you're caring for a child with a severe disability, it has huge impacts on the whole family, as Diane's stories tell us. So at the moment, the U.S. is providing $30 million a year to help health and disability programs in 10 of the provinces that were heavily sprayed by Agent Orange. 2 provinces were just added this year, or last year, I should say, in the far south of Vietnam, and that they should be prioritized to accept those, to assist those persons with disabilities that may be related to the use of Agent Orange and exposure to dioxin, to really hone in the funding to reach this population. To date, the U.S. has provided nearly $500 million to address both the environmental impacts of the use of Agent Orange during the war, as well as the health related impacts. In addition to funding coming out of the foreign appropriations bill, Senator Leahy was able to get the U.S. Department of Defense to also contribute $15 million a year to help with the cleanup of the Bien Hoa Air Base, which is quite an unusual outcome. The Department of Defense does not does not fund the cleanup of their military toxics around the world. So it's quite unusual that this is happening. I think more needs to be done in this area, but at least we've got this. The projects in Vietnam right now are primarily being funded to organizations that are working on disability issues for rehabilitation, for supporting caregivers with training and peer support, because, as we said, caring for children with severe disabilities is impactful on the whole family. Also, disability rights. Some of these organizations are Vietnamese NGOs, with some 2 international NGOs also helping to bring services to people with disabilities that could very well be impacted by Agent Orange. In my mind, not enough of this funding is going to help the whole family, particularly their economic needs, because the children who have, families with children with severe disabilities, and many of these are, when I say children, they're actually now adults. They're in their 30s or their 40s. It really has a huge impact on the family's livelihood and their standard of living. And so I think more needs to be done to help that. Slowly, things are moving in, hopefully in that direction. But it's certainly the programs are trying to reach people with severe disabilities so that they can have a better physical condition, as well as access to jobs and to schooling and access just to transportation. And more needs to be done in this area, but I'm happy over the years that this population has been much greater targeted, and hopefully we'll see some more results very soon. Senator Leahy, of course, retired So our biggest champion on this issue has left Congress, left the Senate. But we now have, thankfully, Senator Merkley and Senator Van Hollen, who visited Vietnam last year, who have begun to take up this issue as well. And there's, of course, other senators and people in the House that we are working on getting on behind this issue as well. So there is funding in this current fiscal year's, well, yes, the current fiscal year bill that has not yet been passed in Congress, that will provide also $30 million to address the human health side, and then the funding for the continuing cleanup of Da Nang. As for Laos, we really do not know the full extent of the impacts of Agent Orange in Laos. My organization began to survey villages along the Ho Chi Minh Trail that were heavily sprayed to see if we are seeing the same types of disabilities in these villages, these sprayed villages, as you see just across the border in Vietnam, and we are finding these same types of disabilities. The Vietnamese who live, I mean, the Lao who live right on the border are very well aware of what's happening just a few kilometers away across the border in Vietnam. And they understand that the U.S. is providing support to people with disabilities in the sprayed areas of Vietnam. And they were asking us when we would go to these villages, why are we not being assisted? And finally, just before Senator Leahy was able to, before he left Congress, he was able to put in $1.5 million in the appropriations bill to provide health and disability programs to assist people with severe disabilities along the areas where Agent Orange was sprayed. On the environmental side in Laos, we really do not, there will not be these large dioxin hotspots that you saw in Vietnam, though there may be smaller areas where barrels were stored, including Long Chen, which is where this photo is taken, which is where the US CIA was headquartered with Vang Pao. And we do know from oral histories from Air American pilots that barrels were loaded of herbicides were loaded on at least one plane to spray around that area. So barrels were sprayed or were stored on this base, but no testing has yet been done in Vietnam, in Laos, except for one base in the southern part of Laos that we didn't even know the U.S. was located on. Hatfield went 20 years ago and tested the soil on a base called in Dak Chung in Se Kong province and found elevated levels of dioxin, and villagers who had told them they recall seeing barrels on this base. So we suspect there are these smaller dioxin hotspots. And of course, the concern is people living on these areas where these barrels were stored. That's we really would like to see the soil on these former bases where people are living tested to make sure that there is no problem with dioxin contamination on those bases. So thankfully, Senator Leahy and Tim also put that language in the bill to allow for testing, though we still haven't gotten to the point where the Lao are ready to start conducting testing on various bases. This is a photo of Hong, which if you saw Diane's book cover, the photo was taken by Goro Nakamura, who is a Japanese photographer who had visited this area in Kamau district in Vietnam over a period of 30 years, almost 40 years, I believe, every 10 years to take a photo of this one area. And the photo that's on Diane's book shows this young boy, Hong, who grew up, his family's house was very near this area that was heavily sprayed with Agent Orange. That photo was taken in 1976. And 20 years later, Hong became very, very ill with something similar to Parkinson's. They never really thoroughly diagnosed him, and then died a few years later. So it's the human health impacts continue. Again, I mean, we can go in the Q&A a discussion about how do you know whether Agent Orange has caused all these problems. It's very controversial. It's really hard to pinpoint if one individual's health is problems have been caused by dioxin, though there's plenty of scientific research on animal studies that show that dioxin can cause various disabilities. So a lot has been done since Diane did her interviews, but a lot more needs to be done to help the Vietnamese and the people in Laos who have seriously been impacted by the Agent Orange. And also left out of this story really so far has been the impact on the children of Vietnam veterans who also are not receiving, they're not receiving any support for the birth defects and disabilities and illnesses that they believe are caused by Agent Orange. So we've gone a long way, but we haven't quite finished the story. And I think Diane's book is very important in keeping this conversation going. So I'll end here.
And let me introduce Lady a little bit to those who don't know her. There's so much to say. She's been in Vietnam since during the war. She was there with the American Friends Service Committee, and she taught, let's see, one sentence. She has worked for 55 years plus on all sides during and after the American war in Vietnam. Her work on Agent Orange began with Dr. Thun That Tung, one of the early and internationally renowned doctors who brought the issue to the forefront in the 1970s even. She headed the first delegation of American educators to visit North Vietnam in 1975. There is so much more to say. She has made so many things happen, been the link in Vietnam. But let me be quiet, and Lady, please, over to you.
Okay, I think I can unmute. Has that worked?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And really, what an extraordinary presentation. And so good because we have the soul with the voice and we have the information kindness of Susan. I want to recognize Chuck Searcy.
Yes.
Because for many years, during what I call the period of silence, there were two Americans inside Vietnam who were willing and able to talk about it. And I was one, but I had the full support of my organization and my boss. And Chuck, as a veteran, did not have full support. And he was pushed aside by two veterans organizations who were themselves caught in the midst of their own politics in Washington, I think, as they dealt with this issue. But Chuck was consistently quiet-voiced and, as the Vietnamese would say, active around the village well on this issue. And I think he continues to be so. He is the primary person who has dealt with UXO, unexploded ordnance. And whenever you have that in the southern part and the central region of the country, you also have Agent Orange. And so he has interlocked those two pieces of work. I want to make a substantial correction, if I may, to what Susan talked about. Referring to the Hatfield study, because I wrote the proposal for that hotspot study, co-wrote it with Wayne Brunichuk. And the owner of the proposal was the 1080 committee. It was a Vietnamese institution. They were in charge from the beginning. I was written into the proposal, but the funder wrote me out. And so then the Vietnamese put me back in. So I traveled consistently, beginning to end. I was the only foreigner who was consistently on that project. The Hatfield people came and went, but I was on the Vietnamese side, and I was at every single test that we did, except one at the Saigon airport that was done only by my Vietnamese colleague, a wonderful doctor, Tan Nung Hung. And he is the one, and 1080 are the people who should be credited for that work. And they did it with Hatfield. Yes. They did the samples in Vancouver, but they also did the samples in Saigon and correlated those two. the science was rigorous. I was trained as my degrees in mathematics and chemistry, and I can't do any of that anymore. And haven't been able to for a long time, but I can think that way. And I know about rigor. And I was the one who insisted on the rigor. And we had the same Vietnamese people using the same process, using the same materials, everything rigidly beginning to end, so that allowed us to compare. And my theory was we could then have this comparison across. And we were stopped. We weren't allowed by the funder to finish. And as you see, 1080 never got the credit for it. But they are the people who did the work. And Wayne Brunichuk wrote up the report, but he was never there. And so it was Dr. Hume and I who scrutinized the report. And we had a great time doing it. It was a bit of a contest between us. What mistakes could we find? Because we needed to find them. And we wanted this thing to be rigorous and accurate so that we could use it. And he was a terrific colleague, and what a terrific team. And the Hatfield folks were also terrific. But they came and went, and they were not consistent. It was different people each time. So we need to credit and change the language and say the 1080 report. Their name was always first, because I did the writing, and I could do it and do that. And that's what made it possible, because it was a Vietnamese project. I want to go way back and just point out that the idea of researching this began in 1965, and it's from Ho Chi Minh. He assigned Dr. Tom Tuc Tum, whom I met in 1975, 10 years later, but he assigned Dr. Tom Tuc Tum to research the effects on human health of the chemicals used in South Vietnam. And he assigned to Vo Quy, the ornithologist, the task of researching the effect on the environment. And that was 1965. We had Vo Quy and with meeting the EPA in 2003, so 20 years ago. He did a huge amount of work. So many, many people did. In 75, Tom Tuc Tum asked me to research dioxin, which I did do, but I didn't find anything. It was the period of the Reader's Guide, huge volume of periodical literature. But he also asked me, as did the Women's GYN hospital in Saigon, to send them or get for them professional periodicals. They knew what they wanted. And I couldn't send them because of the embargo. I brought them every time I traveled. I had this huge weight of magazines, journals, medical journals for Hanoi and for Ho Chi Minh City for them to do their research. So that they had, and then I worked with Dr. Dye on his articles because he was a medical doctor and he had no concept, and I'd been trained in chemistry, of how you have to document everything and the rigor involved. And I worked with his colleague, wonderful woman whom Diane knew, on his articles to be sure that they could stand up. And I did that with the testing. And I also want to mention someone else who was very helpful in this process, Jack McManus, because I was 3 years trying to find out where the hotspot would be at Bien Hoa. It's a huge base and many, many runways. And it took me 3 years. A journalist gave me a lead to Jack McManus, and I drove up to see him from Ohio up to Michigan. And I had a map, and I was kind of dancing around him. He had photographs, and we met quite a few times and could figure out where the hotspot would be, because that was a place we should test. And we subsequently did. Jack, I think, is now president of VVA. Wonderful colleague. I had several projects, and I eventually I went all the way through, but I got fired at the end by the funder. But we had some good projects. And one I could just pass off to you, Susan, which was the idea worked out with Wayne. Kids eat dirt, and this was toddlers. We've all raised toddlers, right? Even those of us who haven't had them. We've been around. They're little grazing animals, and they put everything. They're on all fours going around the floor or the outside or wherever, and they're putting everything in their mouths. And so if it's a dioxin hotspot or potential hotspot or anything else, any other contaminant, then they are ingesting it. And the piece that Trudy Bennett added, she's on here somewhere, she has her expertise is maternal and child health. Not only that, but then the mothers pick up the toddlers and they suck on the toddlers' fingers, which means the contaminants enter the mother's system. And if it's dioxin, the only way we excrete dioxin is the women, and that's through breast milk. So if there is an area in Laos or anywhere that there is the possibility, we don't have to test. The tests are expensive and take a long time. We don't have to test. All you have to do is move the toddler. And there are extended families everywhere. So the toddler can go to grandma's house or Aunt Home's house or this place or somewhere just for that period of time where they reach the point where they can be taught, don't put everything in your mouth. I want to emphasize one other point that Susan made, and I think it's really important. My friend Dam Tu, a research colleague for 40 years, who also has a very recent book on Alui, she makes this point after studying that area with the French researchers, that it's the families and it's not children. These are now adults, and it's another generation. And you have aging parents who are late 70s or 80s trying to take care of a full human being who needs full-time care, and they're physically not able to do it. So it's the caregivers and it's the siblings. And Dam Tu makes the point that the siblings miss the opportunities that other kids in that same area would have because of the family situation. So they don't get the same food, they don't get the same education, and they're looking at inheriting this family problem that's going to continue. And so she emphasizes, and Susan was saying this as well, the need to address the whole family and the economics of it, because this is a huge economic weight, because it immobilizes at least one or two people in the family to take care. I think the work that both Susan and Diane are doing, it's extraordinary, and that combination is really important. I will mention one other group who didn't get mentioned, and that is a lot of the Agent Orange and chemicals were sprayed and used by members of the ARVN. That's the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese Army. Many of them are now in the United States. And many years ago, I tried to connect with them, and I did connect with them on this issue of Agent Orange because they were as exposed, I would assume, as our American veterans, and yet they don't have any access to anything, but they were in service and paid for by our government. And so that's a community that I think has not been addressed. When I talked with them about it, they consistently, I didn't talk to a whole lot of people, but I had worked with both people, so I knew people. They consistently were afraid, and they were American citizens, but they were afraid they would be deported. And so they were afraid to raise a voice, which means the voice needs to come from someone else. But that's the kind of work that some of us do, that we can speak out when it's too hard. So I appreciate what I think the work that Susan has done and others with members of our government is extraordinary. And what people like Chuck and Trudy have done, and Diane and Dr. Yun's work, just something we can all join in and support. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks, this lady. And yeah, you're right too. That I neglected to mention the huge role of 1080 committee, and not just them, but Dr. Lake Dai at the at the time. I mean, he was at 1080 committee, and then he moved over to the Vietnam Red Cross and introduced many people to the problems of families impacted by Agent Orange. And none of us would be here doing this work without the guidance and support of the Vietnamese that we've been able to work with over many decades. So thanks for bringing that up. All right, if you have questions, you can either put it in chat or you could just raise your hand and we will call on you. Hopefully I can see you. Hold on, let me get into the gallery view. All right, Charles Bailey, I see that you have your hand raised.
Yeah, let me get my video. Why don't you come back to me? I'm having a little trouble figuring out how to get my video going.
Okay, yeah. Oh, maybe maybe I have you.
Yeah.
Okay, now you should be able to share it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I got a new. Okay, well, first of all, I'm very excited to be hearing this presentation. And Diane, you've just done wonderful work and a real service because people forget. And in fact, the majority of Agent Orange victims today still need help. And so your wonderful book is going to remind everyone that we still have a long way to go. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And thank you, Susan Hammond, for your very thorough and up-to-date and comprehensive description. And I'd like to give a shout out to Chuck Searcy, who I see frequently, but particularly to Lady Borton, who I haven't seen for a long time. Lady, you should mention one other contribution you made, which was to come up with this wonderful book, which was published in 2002, which listed all of the former US military bases in Vietnam. As I recall, there were 2,735 of them. And you brought that book and you brought photographs from veterans who were flying into and out of Da Nang, as well as all of the other things that you contributed. But all of that was really, really key, and I'm delighted that you're continuing to be involved. I think your point about siblings of Agent Orange victims who have missed opportunities because of the families they grew up in, and just underscores an often overlooked point that needs to be front and center. American assistance, well, everyone's assistance really needs to invest in families, and it needs to invest in the same generation as the Agent Orange victims, obviously. And finally, lady, your point about the impact on ARVN veterans. I've tried over the years to work with various groups, particularly in California, on the Vietnamese American Cancer Society in Orange County specifically. And it's tough. And it's also tough getting money for them. So terrific work. And thank you again. I just want to say that when I look at the big overview I think of them as the three Ds. I just made this up listening to Susan. Delay, deadlock, and dedication. Delay was, Agent Orange was unique. It made the Vietnam War unique compared to all other wars before or since. And it posed the biggest obstacle to post-war reconciliation. We were able to deal with displaced people, orderly departure program, American MIAs, UXO clearance, help for UXO victims, all before 1995, all before diplomatic relations. But cooperation, the first agreement to cooperate on Agent Orange happened in 2006, more than a decade after diplomatic relations. This brings to mind the phrase, justice delayed is justice denied. The deadlock, as Lady Borton has very eloquently explained, is around what counts as science. In the early 2000s, the two governments could not agree on what science had to say about the impact of dioxin on human health. Shifting the discussion, as you did, Lady, working with Hatfield, to what science could say about the continuing presence of dioxin in the environment proved to be the breakthrough. And finally, dedication. Chuck, Lady, Susan, Diane, you're all examples of dedication. Of course, Senator Leahy and Tim Reeser used their power and prestige as well to compel reluctant Republican and Democratic administrations to help Agent Orange victims clean up the residue. Susan mentioned about $500 million so far, but we're not even halfway there. Politicians move on. So if we wish to see U.S. assistance continue, focus your advocacy on Senator Jeff Merkley and staff of key committees. Thank you.
And great thanks to you, Charles. We have not said enough about what your impact has been on this work. I'm holding up here the book that you and Lê Quê Xuân wrote, From Enemies to Partners, focused on the work on Agent Orange. Really worth reading for people who don't know this yet. Thank you so much for all your work.
Thank you. It's now available on free download.
Oh,
sorry, Chuck. Let me just. Let me just.
What Diane just said. I want to just emphasize something that everybody on this Zoom already knows, I think, and that is that this whole effort for so many years has operated at many different levels. And one of the key levels that was missing early on and that was filled in very effectively by Charles was the elevation of this issue into something that was no longer just a few veterans on the fringes and some other radicals, disturbers who were trying to upset the U.S. government. When Charles got involved with this and brought the gravitas and also the funding of the Ford Foundation into the picture, it really changed the tenor of the discussion and really made it difficult for the U.S. government to still hide behind this denial that they faced for so many years. So I think everybody knows the details, and there's no point in going into them right now. But just to say to Charles, to acknowledge the important role that you and the Ford Foundation played in this whole process, which was really essential to the point where we are today.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I have a question from Richard Applebaum, who unfortunately had to leave, but it would be good to raise. It says, he wants to know how to bring this message to young people. For them, the Vietnam War was as far in the past as World War I was when he was in high school. But the lessons you have documented, including the importance of lifelong struggle, is completely relevant today. I don't know if anyone wants to tackle that. It is challenging. Though I would say that particularly among the Vietnamese American population, I have spoken to various Vietnamese student association groups who are starting to wanting to connect back to their homeland, their ancestral homeland in Vietnam. Their parent, like my father was served in Vietnam, and he did not talk about the war at all. And just like their parents, they don't talk about the impact of the war at home for the most part either. And so they learn about the Vietnam War slightly in their history classes in high school, not very much. And maybe when they go to college, they may take a course in it. But this issue really does resonate with them once they learn about it. But keeping them engaged can be challenging, as you know, they're young people moving with many different things. And there's many different issues going on around the world that they're very interested in as well. So it's hard to compete, obviously, but it is something that we really need to do is to get more and more young people engaged in this issue, whether they're Vietnamese Americans or Americans in general, or anyone around the world, really. So getting Diane's book to campuses may be a good start. Getting the book in curriculums would be very helpful, I think, because as someone mentioned earlier in the chat, that the stories really do bring this issue home. Her writing really brings you right into that rural village and into that home. And I think trying to get her book into curriculum would be very helpful in maybe engaging young people today.
I'd like to just add that for a while I was teaching young people, and I was partly motivated to move on, get that book out there because of the response of young people, because they thought, my country did this and it has not picked up, it has not taken responsibility for what it did. What can we do? One wanted to use chalk figures on the streets of Boston and raise the issue. Anyway, there were lots of engaged responses to such stories. So, yeah. Yes, and it ties in, of course, to war in general, of which we have far too many of at the moment, but that people are, it's not necessarily a different, divisive, competing issue. It's all together. Wars, pollution, toxic use of toxics on the land, lots of issues that are tied together. Susan, we haven't talked about where we end, but perhaps this is where we should end. We welcome conversation and continued comments, questions, but I don't want to keep people either. We've promised 1 hour and we're beyond that.
Diane, what about a quick marketing statement? Where is your book going to be available, and how can we get it? And will it be at the Bookworm in Hanoi, that sort of thing?
Oh, I don't know about the Bookworm in Hanoi. It's on Amazon, and it's University of Massachusetts Press has it, and you can get a discount from the University of Massachusetts, a 20% discount. I think it's UMass 20.
20. Yes, UMass 20.
Okay, gives you the discount.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chuck.
Good.
Yeah. Andrew, you want to ask your question or your comment?
Yeah, just a very quick question, because I know we're almost done, and that is, Diane, do you have plans for a Vietnamese version of the book?
It was a Vietnamese book, and it was my translation into English. So
Indeed.
yeah. So, I was asked before I published it about a Vietnamese version, and the publisher here said they wanted to get it out here first, and I'd love it to be Vietnamese, but yeah, and I'd love any of your help that bookstores, libraries, anything that would like to have it. Wonderful. I'd love your help with that. Yeah, and any reviewers is great. Charles.
Okay, will do.
I think this is really important to translate it along with the foreword or afterword by Susan and comments by Lady, because this will bring the whole story really up to date, so that making this point that we're not done.
Right.
And if you can get it published by a Vietnamese press so that it gets into bookstores, this would be great.
Yeah. I love this particular Zoom with all the voices. There's so many voices that need to be heard here and have contributed. And yeah, a version of the book with all those voices would be wonderful.
Andrew, is this going to go up on your website, or where?
It's on, yeah, it's going on our website. Chuck.
And yours, Susan?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
yeah, so it'll be on that as soon as we can process it and get it loaded.
Yeah. And I have a friend who's asked me, please put it on YouTube of all places, but she wants to send it out to friends of hers. So why not?
Yeah, YouTube is a great platform.
If anybody does somebody know how to do that, I'm a grandma here.
There's a question, Diane, is the book available in a digital copy? You know, if it's UMass sells it as a digital.
I don't believe so, but I will ask them. I will tell them that people are asking and see what happens.
Okay.
If it's on Amazon, it very well could be.
Yeah.
I don't think so, but we'll see. I'll ask.
We'll find out. Hopefully that would be great.
Yeah.
All right. Unless there's any other pressing questions right now, I think I want to share, thank everyone for their time this afternoon. Diane, you have something else?
No, just thank you to everyone who participated. It's wonderful to see you, first of all. And thanks to Zoom, I can see you all. We can all be here together yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And I'm so glad you're able to join us. And we hope that we can get Diane in some other of these webinars in the near future. So we will keep you posted on that. And then you can let the people who didn't get a chance to be here today, let them know that where the link is. It'll be posted on our website, which is warlegacies.org. But of course, you can also Google search and it'll pop up as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, guys. Great to see everybody.